50 Photos from American Life in the 19th Century. What was life in America like a century or more ago? We can read about it, of course, in books and articles written at the time as well as in the works of historians of the period. But fortunately, we can also see the America of the 19th century with our own eyes, at least the latter 60 years or so of it. The earliest cameras were huge, cumbersome objects that required exposures lasting many minutes, if not longer. The French artist Louis Daguerre introduced the world to the first vaguely viable photographic process in 1839, and some of the earlier images in this collection are so-called daguerreotypes. The first film as such, in something approximating the form we know it in, appeared only in 1885. 1840, Children with a Turkey Cart. Fanciful portraits of children were popular in the 19th century. This one shows a young boy and girl with a cart full of pumpkins and gourds pulled by a couple of turkeys, who almost certainly wouldn't have remained in harness for long. The source for this image dates it from about 1840. If that's correct, it would be a very early example of such portraits, as commercial photography in the form of daguerreotypes was introduced to the world only in 1839. 1848, Steamboat on the Cincinnati waterfront. Growing out of a settlement founded in 1788, Cincinnati was the first major American city established after the Revolutionary War. It was a boom town during much of the 19th century, thriving after the introduction of steamboats on the Ohio River in 1811, with pork and hay as its major exports. The shift from steamboats to railroads as the principal means of moving freight in the late 19th century slowed the city's economic growth. 1850, the slave market in Atlanta. This store on Atlanta's Whitehall Street, seen in the pre-Civil War years, doubled as a slave market. The man with the rifle sitting outside to the right of the entrance was presumably a guard. The photographer was George Norman Barnard, who later became the official Army photographer for Gen. William Tecumseh Sherman's military division of the Mississippi. 1859, Cottages on the Hudson River. This photograph of cottages between the railroad tracks and the Hudson River, at West Point, New York, was originally part of a stereoscopic image taken by a noted Victorian-era English photographer, William England. The shots he took on a tour of America and Canada in 1859 were among the first photographic views European audiences had of North America. 1859, America's first oil field, Titusville, Pennsylvania. The first oil well in the U.S. was drilled by a New York businessman named Colonel Edwin Drake in 1859 at the confluence of Old Creek and Pioneer Run, southeast of Erie. By the mid-1860s, dozens of additional wells had appeared on the site. A local photographer, John Mather, documented the scene with this and other photographs. Note the signage for the curiously named the Shoe and Leather Petroleum Company. 1860, slaves carrying cotton. This picture of slaves returning from the cotton fields somewhere in South Carolina, probably shortly before the Civil War, was taken by the noted photographer George Norman Barnard. The state had a larger number of slaves per capita than most other states at the time, though the majority of them worked harvesting rice, not picking cotton. 1861, the U.S. Capitol Dome under construction. The first dome on the U.S. Capitol building, made of copper-covered wood, was completed in 1823, after the building was expanded in the 1850s. It was deemed unpleasant to look at and a project to replace it began in 1855, continuing for 11 years. The second dome, still in place today, is cast iron, painted to resemble the stone facade of the building it surmounts. This photo was taken on March 4, 1861, the day Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated for his first term as president. 1862, a Washington, D.C. hospital ward. Campbell General Hospital was a Civil War facility for Union soldiers in the nation's capital, operating between 1862 and 1865. It was unique in having a theater where plays were presented nightly for the patients, like those pictured here. The unusual American flag hanging from the rafters, in use in some places from 1861 to 1863, has 34 stars. The significance of the 4 stars in the middle isn't certain, but they may represent Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, which remained in the Union even though they were slave states. 1862, field workers on Edisto Island, South Carolina. The New Hampshire photographer Henry P. Moore traveled south during the Civil War to take pictures of the 3rd New Hampshire Regiment as they bivouacked on the South Carolina coast. At the same time, he also photographed slave life in the region and took a particular interest in African American farmers. Like those in this image, after the Battle of Port Royal in November of 1861 left them free of their masters though not yet officially emancipated. This shot was taken on the former plantation of one James Hopkinson on Edisto, one of the state's sea islands. 1862, former slaves in Virginia. Taken after the Union Army had seized portions of southeastern Virginia during their Peninsular Campaign in 1862, this photograph shows a group of enslaved men, women, and children who sought refuge away from their masters' plantations behind Union lines. While federal law dictated that escaped slaves be returned to their owners across the Mason-Dixon line, the Union forces began labeling these people as contrabands or contraband of war, and enrolling them to support the war effort. 1862, the crew of the USS Monitor. Launched in January of 1862, the USS Monitor was the U.S. Navy's first ironclad ship, and a participant in the historic Battle of Hampton Roads on March 9th of that year, when it fought its Confederate counterpart, the CSS Virginia, built on the hull of the scuttled USS Merrimack. This photo shows the crew of the Monitor relaxing on the James River on July 9th. The ship had a short lifespan. It was lost at sea in December that same year. 1863, the William H. Webb Shipyard in New York City. William Henry Webb has been called America's first true naval architect. Inheriting the Webb and Allen Shipyard from his father in 1840 and renaming it for himself, he became the country's most successful shipbuilder. He designed scores of vessels, and his enterprise turned out some 133 ships between the time he took it over and 1865. This image shows the construction of the Re Don Luigi di Portogallo, an ironclad built for the Italian government. 1863, U.S. military railroad ties in Alexandria, Virginia. The U.S. Military Railroad USMRO was an organization established by the United States War Department to maintain and operate any Confederate rail lines seized by the Union Army during the Civil War. Established in February 1862, the USMRO would come to be responsible for over 400 locomotives and over 6,000 railway cars. In this picture from a USMRO rail yard in Arlington, VA, one can see the supply of rails kept on hand to make sure that the lines could continue to operate to the Union's benefit. 1864, the U.S. Sanitary Commission in City Point, Virginia. The United States Sanitary Commission was a volunteer relief organization established in 1861 to provide moral and physical support to sick and wounded Union soldiers during the Civil War. One of its initiatives was sending canned and pickled produce to the front for the Army's nourishment. The soldiers and volunteers pictured here are at the Commission facility in City Point, VA, since renamed Hopewell. 1865, cattle grazing in Washington, D.C. The grounds where the unfinished Washington Monument stood were used during the Civil War for military drills and for the grazing and slaughter of cattle. As many as 10,000 fed there at one time, according to the poet Walt Whitman. The large building in the background on the right is the U.S. Treasury, and the top of the White House is just visible to the left, above the trees. 1865, ruined buildings in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond served as the capital of the Confederate States of America for all but the first few months of the Civil War, and was also one of the South's most important cities economically, as a railroad hub and a center of iron-making and other industries. When it fell to the Union Army in April 1865, much of the city was destroyed. Though not always by the Union, before evacuating, the Confederates set fire to buildings holding stores of tobacco and foodstuffs to keep supplies out of Union hands. And the flames spread through the entire downtown business district and destroyed the city's ironworks. 1865, a view of Hudson Street, New York City. Because of its proximity to the piers along the Hudson River, the area of Manhattan now known as Tribeca for Triangle below Canal Street was a thriving business district in the mid-19th century. No. 5 Hudson, seen at the right of this image, is now the site of King's Pharmacy, a well-loved neighborhood business. 1865, the Grand Review of the Armies. The Grand Review of the Armies was a two-day military parade held in Washington, D.C. to celebrate the defeat of the Confederacy in the Civil War. On May 23, 1865, 80,000 soldiers in the Army of the Potomac marched down Pennsylvania Avenue from Capitol Hill to the White House, where General Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the victorious Union forces, and the newly inaugurated President Andrew Johnson Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated only a month earlier, were among the dignitaries on the reviewing stand. The next day, the 65,000 men of the Army of Tennessee and the Army of Georgia repeated the march. 1865, the execution of a Confederate war criminal. The notorious Andersonville prison, officially called Camp Sumter, was a Confederate prisoner of war facility in Georgia. As many as 45,000 captured Union soldiers were incarcerated there in 1864 and 65, about 4 times its capacity. Conditions were horrible, food and water were insufficient, and disease was rampant among the prisoners. Almost 13,000 of them died. After the war, the commandant of the camp, Captain Henry Wirz, was tried and convicted for war crimes for allowing the mistreatment. This photograph shows him being hanged in Washington, D.C. on November 10, 1865. 1866, freight wagons near Lake Tahoe, California. In this image, wagons carrying supplies to the Comstock Lode, a silver strike in Virginia City, Nev, approach Swift Station on the Carson and Lake Bigler Road in the Sierra Nevadas near the eastern shore of Lake Tahoe, a body of water that straddles the Nevada-California border. Swift's was an inn where teamsters stopped near the crest of the mountain. 1867, a view of Main Street, Salt Lake City. Today a city of more than 200,000 people and the capital of Utah, Salt Lake City was founded in 1847 by Mormon pioneers from Illinois fleeing persecution for their religious beliefs. At the time, the area was a Mexican territory, though it came under American control the following year. Though Utah wouldn't become a state until 1896, Salt Lake City was beginning to thrive as a railroad hub and a base for the mining of precious metals and minerals at the time this photograph was taken. 1868. A covered wagon in the Carson Desert, Nevada. This covered wagon traveling across the Carson Desert in Nevada is actually a mobile darkroom belonging to photographer Timothy H. O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan came to prominence working for famed Civil War photographer Matthew Brady. Subsequently, from 1867 to 1869, he became the official photographer for the U.S. Geological exploration of the 40th parallel. He is considered to be a pioneer of geophotography, the recording of geologically significant features of the landscape. 1870, photographer William Henry Jackson on Mount Washburn. This image shows the noted geological photographer William Henry Jackson carrying his photographic equipment on horseback over the summit of Mount Washburn, a prominent peak in what was about to become, or, depending on the exact date of this image, had just become Yellowstone National Park, the nation's first national park, established by President Ulysses S. Grant in March 1872. 1870, the Brooklyn Bridge under construction. The construction of this emblematic span, one of America's most famous bridges, began in 1870. A wire rope suspension bridge, it was designed by a German-born civil engineer named John Augustus Roebling. In the early stages of the project, depicted here, a case in a sealed underwater foundation was launched into the East River at Greenpoint in Brooklyn. 1870, view of Virginia City, Nevada. Virginia City, then part of the Utah Territory, became a boomtown after the discovery of the Comstock Lode, the first major vein of silver found in America. By the mid-1870s, the town had a population of about 25,000 and a thriving lumber industry, as this view showing the Virginia Planing Mill and Sierra Valley lumber suggests. By the late 1870s, the silver began to run out, and the population declined. Today the town has about 855 inhabitants. 1871, a Pawnee family in Loup, Nebraska. The photographer William Henry Jackson, whose images chronicled many aspects of American life and the country's landscape, captured this image of a Pawnee Indian family outside their earthen lodge in Loup County, Nebraska, named for a tribal band known as the Wolf Pawnee Loup Pawnee in French. The Pawnee people are a Central Plains tribe once based in Kansas and Nebraska, who relocated to Indian Territory, in what is now Oklahoma, in 1875. 1872, the Colorado Valley, Texas. The geologist John Wesley Powell led several exploratory missions along the course of the Colorado River in the American Southwest. One in 1869, the first official U.S. government expedition through the Grand Canyon, and another in 1871 and 72. This image, taken by photographer O. Beeman, is from the second trip. Its exact location along the river is unknown. 1876, an aerial view of Omaha, Nebraska. Nebraska was admitted to the Union as the 37th state in 1867, though Omaha hadn't yet become a major meatpacking capital by the early 20th century. It was home to 4 of the country's 5 major pork processing plants. It had begun to thrive when the westward construction of the Transcontinental Railroad began in the city in 1866. This aerial view was taken from the tower of Omaha High School. 1876, New York City seen from the Brooklyn Bridge. Manhattan already had a population of almost 1 million people when this panoramic view of the city was taken from the Brooklyn Tower on the eastern end of the Brooklyn Bridge. Then known as the New York and Brooklyn Bridge, Brooklyn wasn't annexed to New York City until 1898 or East River Bridge. The suspension cables hadn't been installed on the bridge yet, which didn't open officially until 1883. 1896, a hansom cab on Union Square, New York City. The hansom cab, patented in 1834, had an unusual design which placed the driver in an elevated box behind the passenger compartment. This image of a hansom and its driver waiting for customers on Union Square in Manhattan was taken by Alice Austin, a noted photographer who first picked up a camera at the age of 10. She spent most of her professional career documenting life on Staten Island, where she lived. 1897, Italian immigrants, Jersey Street, New York City. One of the many images of immigrant and tenement life in New York City taken by the Danish-American journalist, social activist, and photographer Jacob Riis in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is a group portrait of a family of Italian newcomers to America who lived in a shack on Jersey Street in the neighborhood now known as Soho. 1898, a view of Chinatown, San Francisco. The German-American photographer Arnold Genthe, famous for his photographs of San Francisco, especially of Chinatown and of the aftermath of the 1906 earthquake that devastated the city, shot this picture on Ross Alley, Chinatown's so-called Street of Gamblers, running parallel to Stockton Street and Grant Avenue. The street was built in 1849 and soon became known for its brothels and gambling dens. Thanks for watching.